Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak on amendment number 2904, which is based on legislation that I've introduced with Senator Manchin called the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. As you know, Mr. President, this has bipartisan support. This is a common sense bill that will protect children from child molesters and predators infiltrating our schools. We all know that the overwhelming majority of school employees would never harm a child in any way. But we also know that pedophiles know where the children are. They're in schools. And so schools can be a magnet for the very people we need to keep out of our schools. So I've been fighting this for some time now, over a year and a half, since the legislation was first introduced, and I'm not going to stop fighting this. There are a lot of good reasons to make this fight happen, to secure the protections for our school kids from these predators. For me, the reasons begin with the 3 children that I have, who are 15, 14, and 5 years old. When I put one of my children on a school bus in the morning, I have every right to believe that I am sending my child to an environment where they're as safe as they can possibly be. And so does every other parent in Pennsylvania and every other parent across the country. And we in Congress have an obligation to make sure we're doing all that we can to ensure that they will, in fact, be in the safest possible environment. And Mr. President, sadly, we know that's just not always the case. The motivation, the inspiration for this legislation that Senator Manchin and I introduced is a horrendous story about a little boy named Jeremy Bell. And that story begins, sadly enough, in Pennsylvania, in a Delaware County school where one of the teachers was repeatedly molesting young boys, raped one of the boys. The administrators of the school figured out what was going on. They reported it to authorities, but the authorities were never convinced that they had enough evidence to mount a strong case. They couldn't confidently charge the predator. So the school decided they would dismiss this teacher for sexually abusing his students, but shockingly, appallingly, what they did was they gave him a letter of recommendation to make sure that he could become someone else's problem. Well, Mr. President, given that he was a pedophile and a predator, he surely did become someone else's problem. He went to West Virginia, became a teacher, based in part on the recommendation he got, rose, in fact, to the level of being a school principal, and along the way, of course, he continued to attack and abuse young boys, finally raping and killing young Jeremy Bell. Well, justice eventually caught up with that monster. He's serving the rest of his life in jail, as he should, but it was too late for Jeremy Bell. And the sad truth, Mr. President, is that this is not as isolated an incident as we would like to think and as it should be. In fact, last year, there were 459 arrests of school employees for sexual misconduct with the kids they're supposed to be taking care of. And so far this year, we're on a track to have even more arrests than last year. And mind you, these are the cases where the evidence is so clear that the prosecution is confident in making an arrest and pressing charges. How many more cases are out there where we just don't have enough certainty to actually make the arrest and press the charges? There are many more. So Senator Manchin and I decided we would introduce legislation that would take an important step towards the goal of protecting our kids. Our legislation, Mr. President, has 2 big categories, 2 big features that together would go a long way to ensuring greater security for our kids. One is a federal standard for criminal background checks. And let me just respond to the comments made by the senator from Illinois just a few minutes ago, suggesting somehow that in my legislation it requires a duplicative background check. That's simply factually incorrect. There's no duplication, there's no redundancy. What we do in our legislation is we establish a federal standard and say all of the major criminal databases must be checked, but we don't ask you to check it twice. I don't know how that idea occurred. The checks are a sensible way to make sure that nobody slips through the cracks. We do require that there be a periodic review at the frequency established by the states so that we make sure that we're checking up on school employees periodically. That's not a redundancy. The second fundamental aspect of our legislation after the criminal background checks is we would prohibit the practice of knowingly recommending for hire a predator, a violent abuser, a pedophile. This is, unfortunately, has its own name, this practice. It's called passing the trash. That recommendation was exactly what allowed Jeremy Bell's killer to get a job as a teacher so that he could prey on Jeremy Bell. And our legislation would forbid that. Both of these protections have broad bipartisan support. The House of Representatives, by the way, unanimously passed a bill that has both of it virtually identical just in the last Congress. And just last fall, the House and Senate combined, by a combined vote of 523-1, adopted the Child Care Development Block Grant Bill, which has the same language. It has the same provisions to protect children in child care centers from these kind of predators. I fully support that protection for very young kids. I just fail to see why we shouldn't provide the same level of security and protection for slightly older kids. That's what this is about. So, in addition to the bipartisan support, our legislation's been endorsed by many, many groups, child protection groups, law enforcement groups, prosecutors, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Pennsylvania School Board Associations. There is very broad support for this because it makes sense. And let me go a little bit more into detail about these two aspects. First, the criminal background check. Let's be clear, every state does some kind of criminal background check on hiring for schools, but the problem is many are woefully inadequate. In some cases, they miss entire databases, and so they miss convicts. For instance, some states check only their state database, and they don't check the federal database, so they don't know about the criminal who was convicted 2 states over and moved into their state post-conviction. Another fact is that many states don't require background checks for their contractors. So in our legislation, if you are an adult who has unsupervised contact with kids, whether you are a bus driver, a sports coach, or the janitor in the school, you have to have the background check. Some states don't require that. We establish a federal standard so that we're protecting all kids uniformly. So this whole background check component is what I consider the first part of the bill. The second part, which is really a distinct part, but still every bit as crucial, is this prohibition against passing the trash. As I alluded to earlier, this is the provision that would have perhaps prevented the murder of Jeremy Bell. And we simply say that if a school wishes to receive federal funds, it has to ban this practice. This is so appalling. You know, the idea that someone would knowingly recommend for hire a predator, a predator who's preying on children. It's so appalling. It's hard to believe that it happens, but Mr. President, the fact is it does. And sometimes it happens across state lines. And there's nothing any state can do about the laws of a different state. And this absolutely calls for a federal solution. For example, recently in Las Vegas, Nevada, a kindergarten teacher was arrested for kidnapping a 16-year-old girl and infecting her with a sexually transmitted disease. That same teacher, it turns out, had molested 6 children, 4th and 5th graders, just several years before, and in Los Angeles, California. Now, the Los Angeles School District knew about the allegations. In fact, not only did they know about the allegations, but they were so concerned that when a lawsuit was filed against them, they recommended settling. The Nevada School District specifically asked if there had been any criminal concerns regarding the teacher who was a candidate for a job, and the Los Angeles School District not only hid the truth, but it provided 3 references for the teacher. So I think that makes it abundantly clear. This is a problem that transcends state lines. There is nothing Nevada could have done about the dishonesty and the deceit of the people in the Los Angeles School District who allowed this to happen. So let me sum this up, Mr. President. The Toomey Mansion bill offers a simple proposition. It says if a school district wants to use federal tax dollars, it's got to make sure those dollars are not being used to pay pedophile salaries. I just don't think that's an unreasonable demand. And to To do that, it says there's two components. One is you perform a criminal background check that is rigorous enough to catch people who have criminal backgrounds, and a prohibition against passing the trash. Now, we have run into opposition on this, as you know, Mr. President. In fact, there was a letter signed by a number of organizations led by the National Education Association, the nation's largest teachers union group. And the letter argues that it's basically the thrust of the argument is that it's unfair to exclude even a convicted, admitted child abuser from being a school teacher. Here's the quote from the letter. Individuals who have been convicted of crimes and have completed their sentences should not be unnecessarily subjected to additional punishments because of these convictions, end quote. Mr. President, under this logic, an admitted, convicted child molester can finish the prison term, walk out of the prison, go across the street to a school, and be hired to be a first-grade teacher. That's ridiculous. Our kids are not part of some social experiment to see how often a convicted child molester will repeat their crimes. And I'm not going to tolerate risking trapping small children in a classroom with a convicted child rapist. It's unbelievable. We have a national sex offender registry for exactly this reason, because as a society, we understand these people commit these crimes serially. And even after serving a prison sentence, very often they go right back to their ways. So I think it is perfectly acceptable. In fact, I think it's incumbent upon us to say that when you've been convicted of this kind of crime, you are disqualified from being left in unsupervised contact with children. The same letter from the National Education Association endorsed an alternative that has been proposed, an alternative amendment from Senator Whitehouse. He's proposed an alternative to my amendment, and I find it troublesome, because among other problems, the White House amendment actually would weaken the protections in existing state law. 44 states currently have a category of criminal convictions which preclude a person from ever being hired to teach in a school to have unsupervised contact with kids. And what Senator Whitehouse would do in his legislation, he would require every state to give these individuals the legal right to challenge their being blocked from being hired. That does not exist in 45 states right now. And you have to ask yourself, what possible purpose could there be for mandating that states create these mini trials, some little judicial mechanism to challenge the notion that they should be precluded from a job based on their prior conviction for child abuse? The only purpose would be to get an exemption so that they could be hired. Well, I'm shocked that Senator Whitehouse would propose legislation that would weaken the existing protections that we have in 45 states, but that's what it does. And I would point out that in the case of the Child Care Development Block Grant, which passed 523-1 and was supported by every Democrat in the House and the Senate, by the way, the one vote was for unrelated reasons, that Child Care Development Block Grant language that protected kids did not have this mechanism of creating a quasi-judicial entity so that convicted child abusers could nevertheless be hired. So it wasn't a good idea then when we were passing legislation that pertains to daycares. It's not a good idea now. And I hope that we will oppose this. So, Mr. President, I just want to underscore there's an urgency to this problem. Last year alone, there were 459 teachers arrested for sexual abuse or misbehavior with the children they were supposed to be taking care of. We are on path so far, 6 months into this new calendar year, to have far more arrests than we had last year. Every one of these stories is not a statistic. Every one of these stories is a huge personal tragedy, a shattered life, a stolen childhood, often a family that is just torn apart by grief and misery. How many more of these kinds of arrests are we going to tolerate before we establish a better system for preventing this from happening in the first place? I think there are time for no more excuses. The House of Representatives has already passed this legislation unanimously. All we need to do is pass this amendment on this bill, and it'll find its way to the President's desk. It'll be signed, and our kids across America will be more secure. So I urge my colleagues to support the Toomey Manchin Amendment, Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act, and I yield the floor.